I'm going to be talking about the third eye chakra, also known in this series as the sixth chakra. If you've been following along with this series, you'll know that this is our sixth stop, uh, going from the first chakra all the way up to the sixth, and that each chakra is a perspective or way that we tend to view reality. Each chakra also has, tends to have wounds or blockages that gather there as well. And so with each chakra, I talk about both, basically sharing what is blocking us from having a clear perspective from that chakra, as well as discussing what happens when there is flow or awakening in each of our chakras. I will mention that it is entirely possible for us to have an individual chakra awakening. And so some people, quite a lot of people, have their third eye open, but they do not have the chakras beneath opening and flowing as well. And so an individual chakra opening in the third eye can result in anything from a bit of heightened intuition all the way to significant delusion, psychosis, an experience of being totally untethered from reality, from the communal daily reality that we all, or most of us, operate in. The best analogy I can share for what happens when our chakras open in conjunction with one another is that it is like a river. And so when our first and second chakra open, that river starts to gather a bit of flow, and starts flowing to the third chakra and likewise upwards. And so, in terms of that river flowing through our midline, it's helpful to conceptualize things this way because it offers an important point for consideration. And that consideration is that we can have most of our consciousness, most of that flow in our first and second chakra, or just our first chakra, um, and have just a single drop of consciousness or flow into our third chakra. So, what will happen if we are awakening in that, through the chakra system, is that this river seeks to flow clearly and smoothly, but there may be blockages or a chakra may be shut down or offline or not operating well. And what happens to that river is that that river can be completely blocked from flowing upwards, or it may be partially blocked. And so this kind of brings us into sort of a complicated math territory, at least for for some of us, in which we may have, 90% of our flow in our first chakra, 8% in our second, and then 2% in our third. But for those of us who have kind of had that flow go through our third chakra upwards towards the heart, what is required for that to happen is basically for two things to occur. The first is the breaking of the superiority inferiority loop, as I call it, but it's basically the third chakra's need to attempt to have power by pretending that the self is better than others or inferior to others. We spend so much of our lives doing that, those, competitions, those superiority, inferiority loops. And what they signify is that there's still considerable material in the first and second chakra to heal. And the second thing is that somebody starts to have the light of compassion or empathy come online, because there's energy flow, there's flow of that river going into the heart. And what that means is seeing people as a mirror. In you, I see an aspect of myself reflected. We are, we may be different in some ways, but we have the same humanity. And somebody who is in their heart chakra, who has decent flow going into their heart chakra, will be able to see people before them as human, as fellow human beings, rather than needing to shield themselves or kind of play that superiority inferiority game with others, where they see others as separate from them, dehumanized, or an object of our unhealed projections. In order for the third eye to open or awaken, there needs to be a decent river flow, so decent flowing of that river going through not only the third chakra, but also the fourth and the fifth. That doesn't mean that the fourth and fifth chakras need to be completely flowing, but it needs to be open enough to have a considerable shift in that river, or to have that river's flow be significant enough that it can flow and awaken the structures in the third eye. Before I start talking about the wounds of the third eye, I'm going to actually talk about what the third eye is. Most people have seen paintings, or maybe have felt themselves their third eye, which is generally between and a little bit above the brow area. So somewhere kind of in this area. However, each of our chakras has a front and back. And this gets a bit more complicated when we get to the third eye chakra, when we get to the crown chakra, which I'll talk about in an upcoming video. And this is because the third eye, with most of our chakras, is basically straight through. So if we're talking about the throat, this is the front, and the back, of the chakra is right in back of it. And this creates sort of like a tunnel, or kind of a funnel that expands into our aura on each side. So front and back. With the third eye, it's a little bit at an angle. And so what that means is that it basically is kind of like if you're going in a bit like this. And the back of the third eye chakra is basically where the back of the skull starts. So if you feel in the back of your head, what you will feel is a sort of divot if you go all the way up your neck. This is where our first cervical and second cervical vertebrae are. So basically where the neck starts, where the neck starts. C1 and C2, I will call them, as they are called anatomically. And then we have a kind of hump that you feel, and this bone in the back here is called the occiput. And what is really important about this area is that our visual cortex of our brain is there. So in a lot of ways, it makes sense. What you will find is that physical structure and energetic and spiritual manifestations are all in line with one another. And so what does our third eye have to do with? Well, clear seeing. Is that represented by our third eye going directly through our visual cortex? Yes. And so the other thing to really understand is that where people will definitely feel sensation here, and definitely feel sensation where the neck sort of ends and the back of the skull starts, is that really what we are talking about with the third eye is the midbrain lighting up. So directly the middle of the brain. So if you go with that angle, it's basically kind of here. So directly, if you were to draw your face and do what they, do in beginning art classes where you divide it into quadrants, it would be directly in the center of your brain that this area lights up. And that area is associated not only with what we may term enlightenment, but also the third eye, opening and awakening. So let's talk about something that's a little bit complex and is a stopping point for a lot of people. In the last video, I talked about the throat chakra. The throat chakra not only involves the throat, but also involves the jaw and mouth. If we notice with each of our chakras is that they are basically in charge or create the physical, energetic, emotional structure around them. So for simplicity, we can say that our arms and shoulders are a result of our throat chakra and our heart chakra, both being open and flowing, and that our mouths and our jaws typically for most people have to do with a huge amount of blockage in them, whatever we may want to call it, speaking their truth, opening their mouth, stopping going through life, gritting their teeth and getting through it, um, all just kind of basic stress, all of that sort of stuff. But the jaw and the mouth also very much has to do with the third eye as well. And so one of the most significant blockages that people have is at the roof of their mouth, kind of going up to the third eye area, as well as in the back of the neck, where the C1 and C2, first two cervical vertebrae, meet the skull or the back of the head. There tends to be an enormous amount of tension, and that river of flow that I'm talking about um, tends to have difficulty getting through. And let me describe why. If you may notice as I'm talking, I am opening and closing my mouth, and that most of our midline, this river, it has solid structure to flow through. Well, all of a sudden it comes up to here, it's going through our throat, finally gets through our throat, a bit of that river. And what happens? It doesn't have a solid structure. It doesn't have a solid shore to flow through. It has this opening that is the mouth. And so what happens is that people tend to languish in this area for a long period of time, because for them, going from the jaw area, going from this energy flowing up and able to find the roof of the mouth here, there's an opening that's like about this big, where there's like a gap that is difficult for that flow to flow through. So some people experiencing Kundalini awakenings will naturally find a solution for this. They will start opening and closing their jaws. They will start having spontaneous tongue thrusting, tongue movements, that sort of thing. And so the best way to bridge this gap is to have the tip of the tongue create that pathway and have it find the roof of the mouth. I'm going to keep that instruction very simple, because if you are somebody who is at this point, if you kind of play around with this concept, or if you are at that point, you doing this will naturally create an energy flow that goes up into the nostrils, into the sinuses, into the cheek, and kind of moves past this jaw area. And so it can take a bit to establish this flow. And the best way to do it is through the tongue at first. So this river gets a sense of, oh yeah, I can flow through here. But eventually there can be that river flowing through there just naturally without needing to do the tongue movements. Also, we tend to get quite stuck in the back between the last two cervical vertebrae, so C1 and C2, and the occiput. This is for a lot of reasons. The first two cervical vertebrae are called the atlas and axis. They are very, very important, and they also tend to get incredibly stuck in people. And there's a lot of reason that they get incredibly stuck. The first is that they have very important jobs. Our atlas does exactly what it's talking about. It holds our whole head up. Our axis is responsible for rotating our heads. And so all of this type of movement, like this, nodding up and down, is all because of our C1 and C2, and its ability to have fluidity, have good movement with the occiput, or the back of the skull. And so there are a lot of reasons why people are stuck here, and they can really range. For some people, it will be their jaw, that there's a lot of tension in their jaw, and they need their jaw and some of the structures of their teeth and their mouth to be worked with or to release. I will mention that some craniosacral therapists, some Rolfers or structural integration therapists, as well as some clinical massage therapists, work inside of the mouth. Some Rolfers actually work inside of the nose, which is quite an experience. But that can really help to release these structures. And can be really important for people that are at this point, is to have somebody that can really feel into these structures and knows how to physically release them so that there can be structural openness, so energetic flow, spiritual flow can happen. Sometimes the reason that we're spiritually stuck is actually because of our physical structure. And yes, this is kind of a chicken and the egg argument, but uh, if somebody comes to me and they, fell and hit their head, if they could go through, 5 craniosacral therapy appointments, or, 20, appointments, with an energy healer, obviously the 5 to clear up the physical structure, would be more helpful. The other is people have experienced all sorts of neck problems, neck pain. I've talked about this in some of my books, have experienced car accidents and, so whiplash, things like that. Some people have neck trauma without recognizing it, particularly birth trauma. There's all sorts of weird things that happen in birth that impact the neck. There can be forceps or vacuums, or just getting stuck in the canal and being kind of grabbed and yanked out and stuff like that. I will also share, though, that commonly what happens with people, why this area locks up, is that we spend so much time on our phones, so much time outside of the sort of biped gravity that we're intended to be in. So much time without our heads and necks sort of, in line with gravity, sort of straight, that we build up a lot of tension, and we build up a lot of muscular and then energetic spiritual dysfunction, basically as a result of doing this all the time. And another reason is that in craniosacral therapy, we talk about how the sacrum, so the tailbone, the back of the head, and then a bone that kind of looks like a butterfly that is um, behind the eyebrows and goes into the temples. These are 3 structures that are all intended to work together and flow together. And what that means is that if one of these structures is really stuck, the sacrum, the occiput, or the the bone here, the sphenoid, is that all of them are going to be stuck. And so sometimes it requires a talented body worker, or somebody really talented with energetic or spiritual work to get us out of some stuck places, because It is sometimes not as easy as, oh, you have neck pain, hammer, meet, nail sort of thing. Like, let's focus there. There needs to be a focus on how our bodies operate in gravity, and they're, all sort of pulleys and levers and all sorts of things that are meant to work in synchrony with one another. And if one thing is off, that can set off a domino effect in which other things are physically, energetically, spiritually off in our bodies as well. So let's talk about more about spiritual stuff. I'm an anatomy nerd and can talk about that quite a bit. I'll revisit anatomy nerding when I get to talking about cerebrospinal fluid, but I'm sure you're all waiting in breathless anticipation. But let's talk about some of the spiritual, emotional barriers to experiencing that flow. So, one of the beautiful things about this chakra is that the end perspective is going to be light. Um, but there's a question of how we get there. I talked about some of the physical limitations, which are um, quite apparent in a lot of people. A lot of people just get really stuck in this area for good reason. But there are a couple of things that cause for people to hesitate having this area open. And one of them is more of a kind of a conceptual one. It is that if you have taken the time to train for a triathlon and you have gone along your route for the triathlon and you are, let's say 10 minutes from the end of that triathlon and going across that ribbon or going to that end point, there is a natural part of us that tends to freak out. For those of us that have truly engaged in an in-depth spiritual process, the idea that realization can authentically happen, that it can be permanent, that it could be established, that it isn't something that happens momentarily and then is sort of taken away, but is something that somebody who has put in the time and the effort and the sacrifice and the work can actually find themselves across that finish line, is something that tends to block a lot of people. And part of it is that we tend to get very used to our chaos. I talk about this in my book, The Body Deva. I call it the tornado of chaos in there. But we are used to experiencing a certain amount of entropy in our lives. And when you get more and more into the upper chakras, particularly the third chakra, what happens is that life becomes profoundly simple. But we get used to our chaos. We get used to our tornado of chaos. We get used to our kind of entropy, our difficulties. And so, believe it or not, we can fight and struggle to sort of keep things in complexity, to keep sort of experiences separated instead of connected. One of the best descriptions for enlightenment that I find is the end of conflict, and things become enormously simple. As I said, you either do things or you do not do things. You either, something is or it isn't, or it is both things at once, which sounds complicated, but I'll talk about it a little bit more. But when you get to the point of the third eye, things become enormously simple, and there can be difficulty in letting go of the complexity and the chaos and the conflict because we are used to having our lives sort of ruled by conflict and chaos. One of the things that happens very clearly at this point, and again, the third eye is really the clarity chakra, is that you can see out in the world how much suffering, how much noise, how much chaos there is. And you are able to see it within yourself as well. I talked about this in the heart chakra, ways, kind of stop resenting people or pushing people away because you recognize that they are simply beings that are in pain. Doesn't excuse their behavior, but it's a different outlook. In the third eye chakra, it's a bit different because you can see with clarity the enormous amount of pain and limitations people operate under, how people are continually shooting themselves in the foot, getting in their own way. Um, the things that we most ardently want, that we most passionately want, connection with spirit, connection with the divine, connection with other people, feeling less isolated, alone. All of these things we have developed so much armoring, so much shielding, so much pain regarding. And from the third eye perspective, it becomes enormously obvious how much we are fueled by a need to prove ourselves, how much we are fueled by feeling worthless and unloved and not okay to exist simply as we are, how much we try to prove ourselves to the world in order to be able to say, like, yes, I have a right to exist. And a lot of that comes through that superiority inferiority loop. I have a right to exist, not because I am who I am, but I have a right to exist because I'm better than everyone. Look at me, I have achieved this. That makes me superior. And so that means that I am worth something. And so one of the things that happens when people get to this point is that the limitations that are still left to self-love, to self-care, become very, very present. When we are totally in chains, when we have chains upon chains, when we have 500 chains upon ourselves, 1,000 chains upon ourselves, we will definitely feel that weight. But the idea of escaping that, the idea of releasing some of that weight is incredibly difficult for us to fathom. When you get to the point of the third eye, what happens is that you may only have 3, 5, 7, 2, 10 chains left. And what happens at that point is that you become acutely aware of the chains that remain. And so this can actually stress people out quite a bit because what our tendency is to ignore kind of some of the really big stuff to the end. And so we may have healed so much stuff, but we may have a couple of really big things to heal. So we may be operating in a reality in which we have released 498 of our 500 chains, but those two big chains are whoppers. They're what is keeping us so disconnected from ourselves, so disconnected from the divine, so disconnected from the world. On an energetic level, we can talk about this again as that river, as that flow. What you start to notice is anything within you that is not in that state of flow, where that flow is limited, where that flow isn't flowing. And when we have, when things are completely offline or completely stuck within ourselves, we may notice that on some level, but when you are almost completely in flow, but there is one huge rock in that river that is diverting things, you will notice that even more and become acutely aware of it. In talking about flow, there can be an awareness at this level that things are flow, that we are flow, that an experience of pulsation, of divine rhythm, of basically rhythm and flow. And this is difficult to put into words, even though I just did, but there is an awareness from a very human-centric existence. I am human, I am the center of things, I am the center of reality, into understanding that everything is connected, everything flows with one another. Um, all of existence is woven together, all of existence is one, and the experience of that is quite beautiful, but it is experienced on a physical, visceral level as flow, as connection, as light. One of the things that tends to happen with people are at the upper chakras, and for sort of convenience, and there is a bit of falsity to this, I am, kind of delineating, okay, this happens in the fifth, this happens in the sixth, this happens in the seventh, but really we were talking about that flow, being able to flow up through the throat and going into the head. So the head and the body experiencing flow. And this is incredibly important because when our head and our body are aligned, when they are working together, what happens is that flow coming down and flow coming up can meet and can, combine, and with breath can turn into light, can turn into the descent of grace, can turn into bliss. If we are talking on a technical level of what creates bliss, is that upward and downward flow being able to meet, creating union, connecting, combining. But let's take a step back for a moment. And if we are talking about what is preventing that third eye perspective from totally coming online, and I consider the third eye perspective to have internal light, so filling up the midbrain, emanating from the head, emanating around the body, emanating through the body, as well as seeing that light in existence as well. So seeing that light in the world. That is considered the sort of completely open or completely flowing perspective of the third eye chakra. And so if we were to take that step back and ask what's preventing us from coming into this perspective, um, there are the physical structures and energetic that I've talked about already. There is also the issue of pain. And so, rightfully so, most of us have spent most of our spiritual path seeking transformation, seeking changes in consciousness. I will share that at the beginning and middle, and even towards the end of my path, I would do things like that were pretty extreme rituals, going to workshops that were quite intensive for a week, seeking out gurus and teachers, and um, putting myself through some pretty intensive meditation, ritual, spiritual experiences, as well as having them spontaneously happen to me. That we're all intended to create catharsis, or this change or shifting in consciousness that is pretty extreme. And my experience and the experience that I've worked with people who have reached this point is that that catharsis starts to be questioned and let go of at this point. In a simple way of talking about this, consciousness no longer needs to be changed. There is no longer seeking, like a drug seeker, drug addict would seek to create huge changes in consciousness, to seek away from the body, to seek away from this world, because everything starts to come together. Everything starts to become a lot quieter, a lot less chaotic, as I talked about. And one of the ways that this happens is that energetically, physically recognizing wholeness. And so sometimes I work with people doing spiritual healing, energetic healing work, And all of a sudden they will say to me, oh, wow, it's like I never had a hand before. We worked with that area. It was empty. It was blocked. It was, there's something going on. And all of a sudden they come from a place of disconnection, of separation, and they recognize that they have a hand or an abdomen or a throat, shoulders, spleen, whatever is going on. We come to the third eye, things sort of click into place more in wholeness. So people earlier in the path may need to work with their hip to come online, to feel flow, to feel energetically okay. People who are at the point of the third eye will feel their entire left side start to come together and feeling a sense of flow and congruity through it. Or feeling that through the midline, feeling that through the whole body, feeling that through the whole head, feeling that through whole acupuncture channels, if you know those, feeling that, for example, in the upper half of the body or the lower half of the body. But it's sort of like things click into place and come into wholeness. And the more things sort of click into place and come into wholeness, the more flow we have. And the more in kind of the present moment we are, and the more we start to experience that light of existence, that light of the third eye coming online, in which we do not need to seek catharsis or seek magic or spirituality as a separate thing anymore. Um, as cheesy as this sounds, there is a point where you recognize that magic, that the other is you, it is part of you. You are connected to the divine, you are part of the divine, you are the magic, you are the meditation, you are the whatever, the Tai Chi, whatever your thing is, you are the yoga. Can you still do those practices? Of course. I will say when I got to this point that I stopped doing magical ritual, occult ritual, and part of it was just because it took up so much time, it took up so much energy. And so for a period of time, I didn't do ritual, I didn't meditate. And that was because I was happy to sort of settle into this place where, you know, I could be in that sort of Thich Nhat Hanh place of like feeling that present moment awareness while washing the dishes sort of thing. Feel that magic sort of flow through my existence. I will say that when people sort of come back down to earth, there can be um, doing things like, like yoga or whatever your thing is, again, meditation. And for some people, there is not a break whatsoever, but there tends to be at least a reconsideration of which aspects of spiritual seeking are taking somebody away from their daily lives, from their bodies, from their existences, which parts of them are spiritual bypassing or trying to look away from this world rather than more deeply into it. And feeling more grounded, more settled, more sort of flow, the spirit and matter combining and no longer being, separate things within us. And so being willing to look at what is blocking that wholeness at this stage is helpful because it's like, oh, maybe I should get help for my entire left side, my entire right side, my entire head, whatever the thing is, whatever is preventing things from coming into wholeness. The big thing, though, and I will not do a separate kind of darkest aspects of this chakra because I'm going to talk about it now. The big thing, though, is that you start to recognize and settle into what esoterically is known as the static principle. And in kind of plainer speak, that is, we've spent so much time trying to change ourselves, trying to become something other than what we are at the present moment. And one of the things that really blocks people here is that they recognize that there are certain aspects of our personality, of our being, of our way of life, of how we express ourselves that are unlikely to change. I know that this is the exact opposite of what people want to hear. And, you know, what I might term kind of predatory spirituality is all about this. Yes, if you are depressed, if you are panicked, if you are anxious, if you are miserable, you can 100% change that. You can become rich if you just change your thoughts. Um, you can become totally healthy and wealthy. Kind of give it, that tagline, if you're only spiritual enough. And the truth is that we do tend to get in our own way or shoot ourselves in the foot a lot. And so, if somebody is willing to look at that, there may be considerable leaps and bounds that happen in terms of healing, in terms of, even financial security and, kind of stuff like that. But there is this sort of tagline in spirituality that if only we are enlightened enough, if we are only different somehow from who we are right now, if only we were spiritual enough, we would have it all. And that isn't what happens at all. If I am working with somebody, just to be really, I guess crass about this, if I am working with somebody in a wheelchair, they can totally get to this point, come into this point, have everything in their body completely flowing. Are they going to walk again? No. Um, and the same thing can be true for so many things that we suffer with and we experience. For example, if I were to say, let's picture two booths. If one booth is saying, okay, you are depressed, and if you are only spiritual enough, you will never be depressed again. That booth is going to have thousands upon millions of visitors. If I'm at the second booth or anybody like me is at the second booth and saying, okay, if you really work with it, your depression could reduce 50%, 25%, 75%, 98%, for some people, 99.7%. But all along that, you may be a person who has that sort of melancholic disposition and will need to sort of watch that for this lifetime. The same thing can be true of physical pain as well. I've shared that, I have neck pain. The hardest part of my awakening, certainly I had some difficult emotional parts to work through. But I've been always pretty good about reaching out for support when I've needed to and all of that. But some of the physical stuff is where there are limitations in my being, where that static principle really introduces itself. And so, yes, if I start going out of balance, you better bet that I'm going to wake up with neck pain, or hip pain or something like that. We spend so much time trying to run away from pain, trying to run away from our suffering. And it is a difficult balance with people, because if I introduce that second booth to people, they're going to probably run to the first booth. Um, it takes a specific type of person to understand and appreciate that second booth of saying, okay, let's work with this and see if you're the person that gets to 50% or 97.8% of terms of reduction of this. But what would happen if you were to accept your pain? What would happen if you were to accept and feel into this pain rather than running away from it? And if there is any secret to spirituality, any secret to the light, or anything you want to talk about, it is in that question. How can we experience pain? How can we let ourselves experience the waves of existence to know that we will experience suffering when we are in human bodies, and that there is no truth to the idea that if we are spiritual enough, that we will avoid pain, that we will avoid suffering. if we are able to totally accept that, our perspective considerably shifts. There is an irony that when we accept pain, when we go into the pain rather than avoiding it, that actually some of that pain really relents. It can shift, especially if we know how to work with breath and, stuff like that. But there is something to be gathered of acceptance of pain, acceptance of suffering. I have a lot of people that come to me with this myth of this great fear of, what if the other shoe drops? And by that, I mean that they do not allow themselves to be happy or content or experience bliss, because even in those states, they are aware that the other shoe is going to drop. Basically, something bad is going to happen. And so instead, if you accept, of course, the other shoe is going to drop. Of course, suffering and death and disease and pain and difficult experiences are going to visit us all. What happens, again, kind of ironically, is that we are able to appreciate the bliss, the loveliness of existence, the light of experience, rather than spending our lives when we do experience that light, worrying about the dark encroaching again. The best way that I can describe what happens when we truly accept our pain, when we truly accept this static principle, is that it is like sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Yes, this is an ocean metaphor, and I use it in my shadow work for the soul book as well. But that when we are with the waves of existence, whatever happens to us, we get thrown around by that ocean. If we are mid-ocean, we still get kind of thrown around by the currents and the circumstances of our lives. What happens when we truly sink deeply, when we are at the bottom of that ocean, is that stuff still happens. We still sense and feel all of our emotions. We feel the currents, we feel the waves, all of those go by, but we are in a place of stillness where we have a certain amount of perspective on it. We are within it instead of outside of it, avoiding it, pretending it's not there. We are deeply within the center of that suffering. We are within that quiet point, within that tornado, tornado of life. And so it is difficult for somebody to tell somebody who is in enormous pain, for somebody who is, for example, in a first or second or even third chakra consciousness, that accepting of pain could be helpful to them, to consider that they do not need this huge catharsis in order to experience the divine, in order to heal. But somebody who is in this place of the heart opening, the third eye opening, can start to appreciate gentleness and the power of gentleness, the power of softness. Bruce Lee has a great kind of thought or quote about being like water, and how, of course I love it as a water element, but of how water can really trickle through kind of the cracks of things and can be so powerful. Powerful healing, powerful experiences can be gentle. They can be nurturing. They can be soft. We all could use an enormous amount of softness in our lives. We are so harsh to ourselves. We are so harsh to one another. One of the things that happens when you really come to this layer sort of this perspective opening is that you recognize how much in pain people are, and how much people just want to be told that they're okay, that they are worthy, that they deserve the right to exist, that they're beautiful, that, all of those things, to be held in positive regard, all those things I've talked about that sort of block us in the way. One of the things that happens when you can go into this gentleness is that you can recognize how much people need the quality of gentleness in their lives, how powerful it is, and how powerful that gentleness is within you. So, a couple more things to talk about. One is that when you are in this consciousness, you're really able to see where people are and kind of meet them where they are, you know, um, without sort of any contempt or guile or any of that sort of stuff. It's just people operate in different layers or levels of reality. I talk about this in my spiritual awakening guide. And so something that is very true for somebody, even if they are operating in complete delusion or psychosis or, that sort of untethered experience of reality, being able to meet them where they are at, being able to see where they are at is incredibly helpful. The big thing that people talk about with the third eye is the opening of psychic abilities. I will say that if somebody has opened from the bottom up, that they've already experienced psychic abilities and capacities. I've had some feedback where people are like, you don't talk about spiritual experiences or spiritual powers, or, spiritual capacities, psychic abilities enough. And my answer to that is twofold. My first reply to that is that I have a book called Managing Psychic Abilities. It is one of my more popular books. But for those of you looking to get a handle on your sensitivities, it is what I suggest. So it's a whole book, so I don't need to, talk about it a great deal, even though I'm open to that, of course. And I talk about it in varying ways. But the biggest reason is that there are different tests at different points of our path. And one of them, well, I will say that pretty much all of our tests have to do with power, of the gaining of power, of the gaining of light, of the gaining of flow through our system, which is, all the same thing talked about and expressed in different ways. And if somebody is able to see spiritual experiences, spiritual abilities, psychic abilities as a byproduct of the path rather than a goal, they will continue awakening. Somebody that grasps for those psychic abilities, that wants to continually talk about them and that sort of stuff, they will sort of be led astray. This is one of those tests of power. And I will say that it makes total sense to chat about with friends and with others on your path to be like, hey, how's your awakening going? Hey, have you experienced this before? I think we could all use those like sort of sanity checks or just checking in to see how we're doing. I always teach all of my students, especially in my shamanic curriculums, to only believe 97% of what you are experiencing because that, saves the sanity of a lot of people. Uh, But anyway, psychic abilities really do open at this layer. Synesthesia can open, so experiencing qualities of life, qualities of the senses combining and working together. So somebody can, for example, I see shapes when I listen to music. Sometimes I will paint a song or, something like that. But it can also express mathematically in all sorts of different ways. Numbers can have a specific sound to them, all this sort of stuff. That is quite interesting. But the main thing I would say at this level for the third eye truly opening is that the psychic abilities tend to, instead of being, oh, I tend to be empathic, oh, I tend to have clairsentience, they all sort of combine into one. I will say at this point of the third eye opening is that dream life tends to experience another change as well. Dreams tend to be as real as reality. There's a lot I could go into there, but I will kind of stop there. Is that you can recognize and start to see and experience not only the layers of reality that I talk about in terms of my spiritual awakening guide, but also, um, you know, different dimensions and, different planes of reality, I would call them. And one of the confusing things that happens here is that this is sort of the last stage. And that means is that in previous stages, we work through our childhood, or we work through our ancestry, or we've worked through kind of religious stuff. In the third eye, it is about dismantling this versus that, sort of binary reality, as some may call it. In my books, I call it kind of the mythic and archetypal levels of reality, even though a lot of that may have been healed kind of in this area, upper chakra area. Um, but in this area, there can be a consideration of belief in and of itself, of true and false, about how when we are able to see all those different layers or levels of reality, how something can be true in one layer or level of reality and false in another, and true and false in yet another, and true in the next one. And so the conceptualization of reality and all of these beliefs that we've sort of constructed our identity, constructed our world around, they start to dismantle and release if we are willing to question them. And so this really allows for the dark and light aspects of our nature, that yin and yang, to come together and to open up the crown, which is the next step. I will also mention, along with belief, is the power of story, the power of words. Again, this can probably be a series of 6-hour talks, but briefly, I will say that Um, one of my favorite authors is Umberto Eco, and he says, to survive, we must tell stories. There's a lot of thought and belief that goes into that, but so much of our identity of this world is story, is um, understanding the impact of words and phrases, and an awareness of how we speak to ourselves and how we speak to others, an awareness of what sort of energy we put out into the world with our words, with our stories, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Um, all of these things can either be something that builds ourselves up, or again, sort of shoots ourselves in the foot. If our story is us, quite simply telling us that we suck all the time, that's going to be a different story than somebody saying, I have persevered before and I will persevere again. Those are much different stories, and they form the center of somebody's being. And so having the capacity to directly confront beliefs and stories is essential at this sort of layer of awakening, at this perspective. A couple more things to talk about. I know this is getting long, but it is an important structure, is that things that were once separated start to combine very much so. And so the experience of complete union or complete connection to the divine, complete bliss, complete absorption can happen at the same time as experiencing separation or knowing who you are as an individual. This is actually something I really look for with somebody that has truly opened up the third eye. It's again kind of something similar to the superiority inferiority loop of the third chakra, is that people who experience this as an individual chakra opening are going to talk about absorption and union only. People who have experienced awakening in sort of that grounded way of their whole system becoming that flow will experience one thing and its opposite at the same time. So separation and complete connection at the same time, individuation and complete union. And we don't understand this until we're experiencing it, but it is typical for people who really settle into this perspective to know who they are as a person, to know what qualities shine through them, as well as to feel themselves as a part of everyone and everything as well. There is a lot of energetic anatomy I could go into here, but one of the things that happens when there is flow going into the third eye, when the brain sort of lights up, is that that light is seen through the physical eyes. The physical eyes are capable of um, having light, having soul flow through them, um, being able to utilize gaze in varying ways. So that can be helpful to understand, but I'm going to go back for a moment and talk about anatomy. I know, exciting. One of the things that really happens energetically is that the structures in the midbrain light up when the third eye is awakened. There are teachers that talk about this and a lot of teachers that don't. I remember at the beginning of my path, I had two teachers, and one was very much of the opinion of not to share this sort of information with others because his thought was like people are just going to steal it anyway, and I see that perspective. People are so spiritually hungry, so spiritually empty that they will take basically anything and run with it. Talk about this more in a moment. And I had another spiritual teacher, and she didn't share things like this because she felt that people should be initiated first. And I understand that perspective as well. What I will say is that I once experienced her perspective, both perspectives have been in both those perspectives. And I still often do understand those perspectives, but I have come to a point where I don't care. I've also come to a point where I understand that booth analogy I shared before. Um, I've talked about this with a fair amount of spiritual teachers, and they have been honest with me, and which has been wonderful. But most of spirituality is really focused at people in the first chakra, people who want it all, who want to believe the illusion, who want to look away from their lives, who want to feel special. And spirituality will always offer them that, will always offer a reason for their pain, will always offer them an object to hate or project onto, to other, to dehumanize, to bypass all of that sort of stuff. What happens when we interface with information that is beyond us is that we may not notice it. We may become angry at it, or we may become angry at the messenger of it. But I find that we just don't take things in before we're ready for it. And so I've talked about this, like I said, with other spiritual teachers, and there is a junction, and it typically is at the third chakra, if they're aware enough, where they make a choice about whether they are going to continue their path, of course, but if they are going to teach to essentially a mass audience, or if they're going to teach and offer things to a more niche audience, like people who are third chakra or kind of above the third chakra, which will mean all sorts of things. It may mean, less teaching opportunities, less eyes on you, less book sales, whatever the thing is. But if we go back to that simplicity of the booth, it makes sense because people are in an incredible amount of pain, and any sort of anesthetic that people offer, any sort of hope that people offer is understandably going to be latched onto. We do love our illusions of control. Um, and, if somebody suggests, hey, the world is created out of chaos, sort of let yourself fall into that, experience your pain. Another person says, oh, you can control everyone and everything. That second person is, going to have a lot more eyes on them, a lot more interest in them. Um, and so I'm sharing this because some of you uh, may be at that point of recognizing that, or it may just be an interesting sort of anecdote. Hopefully it serves somebody out there well. Part of the reason that I'm sharing this, though, even though it's interesting, is because I'm going to share a little bit about how spirituality came to the West. There are a couple of routes. There's kind of the direct, Nixon opening up relations with China, and in the late 60s, but especially the 70s, teachers coming directly from India, um, and sort of interfacing with the West in a way that they thought, what they would term like kind of householders would be able to take in. So people who were not going to be a monk sitting on a mountain, people who had everyday lives but wanted to hear about spirituality and incorporate some principles into their lives. We then also have the theosophy route. Theosophy basically was a process of colonization of information from India, from the Middle East, from China, um, and combined that with Western sort of mystical traditions. And out of that came theosophy. There are a lot of interesting books that came out, Blavatsky, and, like all of that sort of stuff. Ledbetter is really well known for his work with the chakras. Um, Pardoning, kind of the crimes and stuff that came about then. Uh, anyway, different conversation. But theosophy then, kind of was more brought more to the West as it kind of evolved into new thought, and brought in spiritualism and a bit of spiritism from, Latin American countries as it came specifically into the United States, and became the New Age movement. And so that is an imperfect description. But the reason that I am bringing this in is because this sort of cherry picking that comes from, um, this sort of spiritual kind of evolution of information really distorts information or emphasizes certain things that aren't important, particularly kind of the idea of the third eye being the pineal gland. Um, there are a lot of structures in the midbrain that are incredibly important, and are part of the third eye. The sort of, kind of back historying, onto this thought that the third eye is the pineal gland doesn't stand much water before 1960s. If somebody wants to say that I'm wrong and has resources for that, by all means. But most of what you're going to find about the pineal gland, being the third eye, is going to come specifically from the New Thought, movement and a bit of theosophy. And now I'm going to share what's known as the Muktananda Blue Pearl problem. And that is, I am well aware that in sharing these sort of things, that what will happen is exactly what happened after Swami Muktananda described his enlightenment, described his river reaching the third eye, reaching the midbrain, as a blue pearl. All of a sudden, other people were like, oh yeah, yeah, I had that experience too. And so all of a sudden, all these people were talking about their blue pearls awakening. Many of you may see kind of like the folly in that, because our spiritual experiences are quite individuated. There's a reason that symbol and mathematics and, is at kind of the top layer of our existence. And so people that I've worked with at this area have had all sorts of different experiences of what actually lights up. For me, I'm a very literal person, so it was a light bulb, but again, this is an individual experience, and somebody really should have the experience of light filling their head happen as a result of their third eye coming online, and emanating outward through the eyes. If the third eye is fully online, if there is nice flow going through there, what will happen is that people will feel calmer, they will feel more still, they will feel more realized in your presence. people can sort of fake a lot of things, but that one is difficult to fake, is that other people awakening simply because of your presence, other people feeling better, feeling calmer simply because of your presence. So before I get to a recap of the really good stuff, I will talk about two more things, one of them quite briefly. One of the things that prevents people from really opening up the center is that idea of the finish line, like I talked about. But for people that I work with, they are often people who, I do work with some monks and nuns and, like all sorts of people like that. I have an interesting clientele. But I will say that a lot of people have this image of Jesus or a monk on a mountain or something like that. And so the thought is that I cannot be that person. I'm not that holy. And so if you're to reframe it with the thought of how much work that triathlon, somebody doesn't just randomly go and do a triathlon. They have had to put a lot of work and effort to get to that point. So anybody getting to this point has trained, has done the work to complete that triathlon. And I will also say that our idea of what realization looks like, of what self-realization looks like, um, is is in some ways a bit different than what actually happens. Um, we picture, this like CEO or this monk, sort of thing. And a lot of times the people that I know that have gotten to this point are quite simple people. And so, they may be a math teacher, they may be a gas station attendant. People equate spiritual awakening with achievement, and that isn't what happens. It is a settling into one's life, it is a reclamation of soul. And so, somebody maybe working at a hotel front desk and be completely, totally realized. Um, and so what happens though is that those people tend to like kind of come out of the public eye. This idea that somebody needs to become a spiritual teacher or a guru or something like that um, isn't true at all. There are plenty of people offering themselves in the world in different ways. And they may be completely realized and, offering themselves as a primary school teacher. And I say that because one of the most realized people I've ever met is a high school math teacher. So teaches teenagers and, bless them for, for doing so. But um, that myth may need to come tumbling down for some people. The last thing I will talk about that tends to block people is this static principle again, but we're going to a deeper level. We've spent all this time trying to change, trying to shift things, the dynamic principle, but we have this static principle, and it is best personified by the myth of Sisyphus. As many of you may know, Sisyphus is the guy who is, tormented, punished to roll up the ball, huge ball, boulder up the hill, only to have it come back down on him. And to have this happen again and again. And so people coming to this point often come to a point of recognizing that many of the aspects of our day, many of the aspects of our life are Sisyphus rolling that boulder up the hill. And if you're able to really feel into that, some people kind of go into depression at this point of recognizing, oh, kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same sort of thought. Um, but I will say Camus' suggestion in his myth of Sisyphus is to imagine Sisyphus with a smile on his face as he's rolling the boulder. But you do get to a point where you recognize that, yes, we have all of these repetitive, meaningless things that we do with our existence every day. I don't want to, uh, checking the mailbox every day, doing specific aspects of our day. I could go into a whole laundry list of them, but most of you are already well aware of them. And so if we are able to accept our inner Sisyphus, we're, able, maybe even perhaps as Camus suggests, to really experience this static part of ourselves, that there are parts of ourselves that, yes, in this lifetime, while in a human body, are Sisyphus. What happens when we accept that instead of fighting against that is that we can sort of see the cosmic humor of things. You know, the French would call it kind of the absurdity of existence, or it would go to that sort of existential, absurd philosophy sort of place that some of you may be familiar with. But this is something that certainly tripped me up for a long period of time when I was here, especially because it starts to go into the crown, which is the last aspects of what I call my spiritual awakening guide, is the destroyer, is the, kind of darkest aspects of ourselves showing itself to be able to say, hey, I'm here. This dark, kind of aspect of yourself, this still hasn't transformed yet. Because as a sneak preview, for the crown to open, the first chakra needs to completely be open and flowing as well. But some people get caught in depression at this point because they are recognizing their inner Sisyphus. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And there is a balance between accepting that and sort of being willing to sit with that and looking towards seeing what aspects, what chains you can still free from yourself. So, recap of the good stuff and a little bit of anatomy. When we experience this river of flow, it goes up into our midbrain, so the center of our head, the center of our brain, and it finds structures there. Being very simple. It lights up those structures. What happens? Flow up and down, but also flow radiating outward, and a starting of flow to every cell of our body. So this is an experience of inner light, which is quite glorious, quite wonderful, quite magnificent within the self, as well as seeing eventually that golden light in reality as well. If we are able to work through a lot of the blockages here, and I'll mention one last one, is that letting go of this idea of needing to be rewarded for everything is part of that static principle. Letting go, if you were to ask yourself, if I, like Ramana Maharshi, were to go out into that hill and not do a single thing with the rest of my life, would I still be worthy? Would I still be, that question can really lead people to a place of awakening these structures. In terms of an anatomical perspective, what is happening energetically, anatomically, is that within the brain, the midbrain, and the spinal column, is that flow will shift to light. I talked about this in my Kundalini video, but we have what is known as cerebrospinal fluid that flows through our midbrain, is created in our midbrain, flows through, kind of gets pulsed, or has, sort of the pulsing flow that kind of goes through, flows through our heads, down and back up again. In craniosacral courses, they talked about this as like a turkey baster, with like kind of the top squishing and it going up, going down and back up again. I thought it was odd at the time, but I still remember it, some 20 odd years later. So obviously it worked. But cerebrospinal fluid is kind of the shock absorber for our nervous system, for our brain and spinal cord, for it also does a lot of like waste and nutrient stuff for our nervous system, for our body as a whole. It's an interesting subject matter to study, but on an energetic level, the cerebrospinal fluid, the inner aspect of the brain, so the brain and the spinal cord, we'll start to experience light, more and more light. Um, the more flow we have through our bodies, the more realized we become. So that was a long one. Thanks for those who stuck with me. And I will be ending this series by doing 2 more videos, one on the crown and one on the spiritual heart and the Bindu point.